and
Perfect.
just let me know when you want to get started.
Okay, well, maybe I'll do a quick welcome for everybody. So thank you all for participating in today's public information session on the Township's official plan project. For those of you who don't know me, my name is April Bess-Swearis, Director of Planning Services at the Township of Lake of Bays. I'm joined today by the rest of the Township's project team, as well as the consultants on the project from JL Richards and Associates, who will introduce themselves in a moment. So as part of the Township project team, there's myself as well as Helena and Arla. So I'll pass it off to Helena and then Arla to introduce themselves.
Good afternoon. I'm Helena Kramer. I'm the planner here at the Township.
Good afternoon. I'm Arla. I'm one of the planning techs here at the Township Lake Base.
Perfect. So before I pass it off to Rebecca and David from JL Richards and Associates, we are joined today by the Township's Mayor Glover, who would like to say a few words. If you can turn on his mic.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Good afternoon, and I want to welcome everyone here today. I understand we have a pretty good turnout. This is a really exciting time, and we want to get participation from everyone. So folks that have joined us today, please tell your friends and neighbors about this process. It'll be going on for quite some time, but it's really, really important to engage and get involved. Because what you have to say will greatly affect the way the town moves forward with many things. So thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to the process.
Perfect. Thank you. And now I'll pass it off to Rebecca and David.
Thanks so much, April. And Dave, I'll pass it over to you to do some of the introductions and pop in later.
Sure. Sounds good. Thanks very much for that kind introduction, April and Mayor Glover. This is a really exciting project, and we're really thrilled to be here working with the Lake of Bays planning team and working with your residents and council on this project. So my name is David Wellwood. I am a senior planner and project manager with JL Richards and Associates. I'm joined, I'll let Rebecca introduce herself shortly. Rebecca is a planner in our office as well. And together we're doing the bulk of the work on this project, along with some sub-consultants I'll mention as well. So I think first on the agenda is I'll turn it over to you, Rebecca, just to go over some housekeeping items, and then you can introduce yourself, and then I'll go through a little bit of planning 101 for those folks who may not be super familiar with planning.
Great, thanks, Dave. So as Dave mentioned, my name's Rebecca Elphick, and I'm a planner based out of our Guelph office. Just before we kick things off, I thought I'd do a bit of housekeeping, just with the Zoom webinar and this being a bit of a different format for doing a public information session. So just a quick note, you might already have noticed this, but during the presentation, the video and audio will only be on for hosts being Township staff and myself and Dave. And when we get towards the end of the presentation and open things up for Q&A, there'll be that opportunity to jump in with your questions and comments. We do have a series of discussion questions as well, kind of peppered throughout our presentation today. So there will be that opportunity for you to provide your feedback using the poll function that you see at the bottom of your screen. So I'll give you a cue when it's time to type a response into those discussion questions. I'm using that poll function. As I mentioned just a moment ago, we will be dedicating some time after the presentation to hear from you. That's really why we're here, to see what kind of comments, input, feedback folks have from the presentation, and to offer some space and time to answer your questions. So when we get to that portion of the session towards the end, we'll just ask you to use the raised hand function that you see at the bottom of your screen. And we'll go in order of hands raised and try our very best to get everyone a chance to speak and share their thoughts, comments, ideas, questions at the end of the session. If we do get too close to 3 and folks have to jump off, that's okay too. We'll do our very best to make sure that everyone has some space and time to share their input, but If you don't get a chance or if something occurs to you after today's session, please do feel free to reach out to Township staff, whether that's by email, by phone, dropping into the office, or popping onto the Township's website to provide your feedback. I will also note that today's session will be recorded and uploaded to the Township's website for viewing after today's session. So just bear in mind as we move forward that the session is being recorded. So I will pass it back to you, Dave, and you can go from there.
Sure. Thanks very much, Rebecca. So just going through how this presentation session will look, we'll start with, as I mentioned, introducing our project team. We'll talk a little bit about what is an official plan, and we'll look at the background research key themes that have come up so far, including a discussion about those key themes and other topics of interest throughout the planning program. We'll talk about next steps at the end and outline future public engagement opportunities, and then there will be a discussion and some Q&A at the end. So on to the next slide, please. So the project team on our side and the township side is shown here. So the township staff have introduced themselves. On our team at JL Richards and Associates, we benefit from the leadership provided by Jason Farragon, our principal in charge, as well as Rebecca and myself. Chris Kerwin, our GIS specialist, is also on the planning team and is busy working at making sure all the land use schedules are of high quality and easy to read. We're also joined by Hutchison Environmental Services, who are reviewing the natural environment and the natural hazards and the shoreline management components of the official plan. So we're joined by Brent Parsons, Andrea Smith, and David Leader from Hutchison Environmental Services. The next slide, please. So I'll go through a little bit about a background in these next few slides of what is planning and how is it done in Ontario. So on to the next slide. I often refer to planning in Ontario as looking a little bit like a pyramid in structure, with the Planning Act at the top, the Ontario Planning Act giving the sort of the rules of the road for land use planning for municipalities. So everything kind of stems downward from that document. In the Planning Act, there's a list of what we call provincial interests, and there's a reference to policy statements that municipal decisions need to be consistent with. So on this screen, you'll see the provincial planning statement, which was as a new provincial planning statement that came into effect in October of last year, which provides the province's guidance on and policy direction on land use planning matters. Some parts of the province, not for Lake Bays, but there are provincial plans that municipal official plans need to conform with. The next rung down is really the District of Muskoka's official plan, which we'll mention briefly in this report as well, and then the Lake of Bays official plan. And then when the rubber really hits the road at the zoning stage, or in the case of the Township of Lake of Bays, the Community Planning Permit Bylaw. On to the next slide, please. So I did mention matters of provincial interest. This slide has some, if you click, there's different words that'll pop up on the screen. So yeah, so the matters of provincial interest deal with the physical environment. So things like the provision of infrastructure and how to efficiently use that infrastructure, how to the efficient use and supply of water and other resources. There's also policies on climate change mitigation and adaptation. The next kind of section of provincial interests are the social environment. So that's the adequate provision of employment opportunities, the provision of housing, policies on ensuring housing is affordable, ensuring development of safe, healthy, and orderly communities. And lastly, the provincial planning statement addresses natural environment provincial interests. So these are things like protecting significant features of architectural, cultural, or historical or archaeological interest, protecting ecological systems, including natural areas, features, and functions, and conserving and managing natural resources such as mineral aggregates and forestry. On to the next slide, please. So what is an official plan? An official plan is the municipality's primary land use planning document. The Township of Lake Bay's current official plan was originally adopted in 1999 with a comprehensive update in 2016. And it sets out a range of policies for the use of land in the township, including the location of residential development, commercial development, industrial development. It includes policies for housing, affordable housing specifically, policies for protecting shorelines, wetlands, and environmental features, policies for protecting resources such as forestry and mineral aggregates. The District of Muskoka also has an official plan, and one of the parts and components of this project is ensuring that the new official plan for the township conforms with the Lake Bay's official plan. I think we'll move on to the next slide, please. So why are we preparing this official plan? As I mentioned, the current township official plan is quite dated, and there has been a whole range, as any planner will tell you, a whole range of legislative and policy changes that have happened in Ontario, even since 2016, when the plan was last comprehensively updated. So this is a chance to look at the legislation that has been passed and the policies that have been changed, and to update the official plan to be modern and current. So I won't list all the different bills and pieces of legislation that have changed the official plan, but essentially the goals of these changes have been to generate provide for an adequate supply of housing and account for pressing issues affecting land use development. The next goal is that we ensure conformance with the official plan for the District of Muskoka. And the next is to reflect all those recent changes to policy and legislation. And lastly, to provide a solid foundation for growth over the next 20 to 30 years. So we are, this slide shows sort of the scope of what we've done so far, as well as what is left to come. So we've finished this background phase on the left side of the screen here. So we've developed a consultation strategy. We've really, kicked off the project. We've undertaken some background research and come up with some discussion papers, which are available for viewing if you haven't seen them on Lake Bay's Engage page. There's also been a jurisdictional review that we've undertaken, including best practices for official plans. And we've prepared several discussion papers. And this is part of the initial public engagement right now. Over the last couple of weeks, we also had some focus groups with specifics, community groups in Lake Bays as well. The next phase throughout the rest of the spring and into the summer will include drafting some policy directions and recommended changes to the official plan. And once we're done that, we'll provide a council update presentation. Moving next into drafting the policies, and that will include an in-person open house in the summer. Where the public will have an opportunity to sit down and talk to us, have a cup of coffee, and go over some of the draft policy directions and to review a draft of the official plan. And then after that, we'll have an opportunity to go back and make some further revisions to make sure that the official plan reflects the input we're hearing from the community. With that said, we are hoping to have a finalized official plan available for council to consider adopting sometime in the fall of 2025. So on to the next slide. So the background research we've done really looks at, so let's go to the next slide, please, looks at all of the current plans and studies and reports that have been done by the township and also the District of Muskoka. And as I mentioned, making sure that we're looking at the most up-to-date versions of provincial and district policies. We've looked at other official plans in the District of Muskoka from neighboring municipalities to try to align our planning approach where appropriate and to incorporate best practices from other municipalities in Muskoka, but also from all over Ontario. Discussion papers are shown on the next slide. And these address four overarching matters of interest that we decided to focus on, although we are looking at all public policy matters, not just the ones reflected in these discussion papers. But our discussion papers address climate change mitigation and adaptation, protecting the natural environment, shoreline development and water quality, and managing future growth and development. And I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca now to go into a little more detail on some of the discussion questions.
Perfect. And thanks for that overview of the planning system, Dave. So these next couple of slides, I have some discussion questions that I'm interested to pose to the group. And this is where things get a little bit more fun for you, hopefully. If you see at the bottom of your screen, there's a poll function. So I'll be putting some questions out to the group and giving you some time to reflect on that question, put some thought to it, and then type a response in the poll that comes up as we move through these couple of discussion questions. And then after that, I'll dive a little bit more deeply into some of the background research that we did on those four themes that Dave just mentioned and some of the recommendations that we're considering coming out of that. So the first is on first kind of set of questions is on local context. And what we're curious to know is what you value most in your community that you feel should be supported more in the township's official plan. And some food for thought, you can add your comments to the poll. Are there any assets that are unique to the communities of Baysville, Dorset, Dwight, or Echo Valley, the rural areas or the waterfront areas that are really important to you that you want to make sure are captured and protected in the new official plan? So I'll give folks about 2-3 minutes for the first question, 2-3 minutes for the next question. And if you have any trouble, hopefully we'll be able to troubleshoot here. Seeing a couple of responses trickle in already, that's great. Looks like we've got about a quarter of folks having put a response in. So I'll give you guys another minute or so if you're thinking about putting a response in just before we move in to the next poll question. Right, looks like the responses are trickling in a little bit more slowly now. I'll give you guys maybe another 15 seconds or so, give or take, if you're finishing your thought, and then we'll open up the next poll question. All right. And if you don't end up submitting a response here and you'd like to include it later on, you can always open these poll questions up at the end. We'll move on to the next one. Thanks, April. So this next one is the second question that you see on your screen here. Whether there are any assets that are unique to the communities of Baysville, Dorset, Dwight, Hillside, Echo Valley, the rural areas or the waterfront areas that you feel should be supported more in the township's official plan.
Noting the slide still shows the first question.
I'm seeing a couple of responses starting to trickle in. That's awesome. I'll again give folks about a minute or two, and I'll give you a 10-second countdown before we move on to the next question. Looks like we're almost about halfway. We'll give folks maybe another 30 seconds or so to finish up what you're typing and hit submit, and then we'll move to the next discussion question. All right. If you haven't already wrapped up your thoughts, hit submit. I'll give you 5 seconds to do that now, and then we'll move on to the next question. All right, seeing a couple of those responses trickle in. Awesome. Thanks, April. We can move to the next question. I'll just shift slides for a second. So on the same vein, and you might have answered this already in the first two questions that we posed to the group, but I'm curious to see what, in your opinion, are the top 3 land use planning issues that you'd like to see addressed in the new official plan. And when we're talking about land use planning issues, think back to what Dave was talking about at the outset, things like employment, affordable housing, protection of ecological systems, maybe that's waterfront or shoreline development. Maybe that's protecting the rural character of those areas in between those built up communities. There's lots of different things that we might think of when we talk about land use planning issues. And some positive and some not. We're interested in both. Starting to see some responses trickle in here, and we'll give folks about 2 minutes too before we move on to the next question. Looks like a couple of responses trickling in. I'll give you about another minute or so. All right, this is your 10-second warning. If you have some final thoughts that you're mulling over, can finish those thoughts up, hit submit, and we'll move to the next question on the slide here. All right, we'll close that one down. Thanks, April, and move on to the next question that you see up on your slide here. So considering some of the land use planning issues that you thought about that came to mind for that question, curious to know if there are any issues that you think are uniquely affecting the communities of Baysville, Dorset, Dwight, Hillside, or Echo Valley, or uniquely affecting the rural areas or the waterfront areas that you'd want to see reflected in the new official plan. And again, I'll give you 2 minutes or so to put your thoughts to that and go from there. Great to see some responses starting to trickle in. A couple of responses so far. Maybe I'll give folks another minute or so to put some thoughts down and submit your responses there before we move on. Oh, they're really trickling in now. All right, I'll give you your 30-second warning. If you have thoughts about this second discussion question on the screen here, I encourage you to put those thoughts pen to paper, so to speak, and in just a little bit, we'll close that poll and move on to the next question. All right. Looks like we've got a good a couple more last minute. All right, we'll close that one and I'll move on to the next question. And so this one is a really big picture question, so I'm going to give you a bit more time than just 2 minutes. But the first part of this question, some folks might be more or less familiar with the township's official plan, might be more or less familiar with what an official plan does, or more or less familiar with the policy that's in the current official plan and how it impacts on growth and development within the township today as it's in effect. So if you don't have specific input that you'd like to share, that's completely okay. But thinking about any specific policy directions or general or specific changes that you'd like to see reflected in the new official plan. And that might be, say you're really passionate about affordable housing. And before today's session, you looked at those policies and said, I wish that the township did this a little bit differently, or say you're really passionate about shoreline development and the policies in that section are great, but I just wish that this was a little bit different. And we'll open up that question now. So I'll give folks about 3, 4, 5 minutes on this one because it's a bit of a meatier question. And not to worry, there's not a quiz at the end of the session. Looks like the gears must be really turning here. Just seeing some responses starting to trickle in. Great to see such thoughtful consideration before putting your answer in. Really starting to trickle in with a bunch more responses. That's great. I'll still give folks another minute or 2 minutes. You know, this one's a bigger picture question that'll take some more thought. Really starting to see those responses roll in. That's great. I'll give folks another minute, minute and a half, 2 minutes. We'll see how responses trickle in before we move on to the next discussion question, and then into some of our key findings and recommendations from the papers that we wrote as part of the background research phase. All right, I'll give you your 30-second heads up. If you have some thoughts that you haven't submitted yet, this is the time to put pen to paper, so to speak, and just before we move on to the next question that's up on the slide here. Okay, so a couple of responses just trickle in there. So we'll close that question and go to the next. And along the similar kind of vein, reflecting back on your work and your role within the township, whether you're a resident, a seasonal resident, a permanent resident, a business owner, a volunteer in a community organization, maybe you work in the township or work, say, for the public health sector or other sectors like education that are influenced by the official plan. Putting on a bit of a different hat. Are there any policy changes that you'd like to see in the new official plan that would support your community or your work in the township? And we'll open up that question. Starting to see some ideas churning, a couple of responses submitted so far. Again, this one's a bit of a meatier question, so we'll make sure we give you enough time, about 3-4 minutes, before we close the poll and move on to the next section of the presentation. Response is really trickling in now, but we'll give you another minute and a half or 2 minutes to start thinking about any policy changes that you'd like to see to support your work or your relationship to the community. Seeing a couple more responses come in, I'll give you your 30-second heads up if you have some thoughts that you haven't put in, that you want to finalize, put some words down, some thoughts and ideas, some comments down before submitting, and then we'll move on to the next section of the presentation. All right, seeing a couple last minute submitters. That's great. Okay, I think we can close this poll. April, thanks. And we will go to the next section. So as Dave mentioned at the beginning, the discussion papers had formed some of our key thinking around some of those theme areas around climate change, around shoreline development, natural heritage features, around managing future growth and development. But that's what we can see from our perch with our land use planning expertise and from the township's perch with their knowledge and expertise of the community. And what I really love about this opportunity to meet in this setting is to hear from you as well. What's important to you, what's important to your work, what you think are the pressing issues that really need to be addressed as we're preparing to put policy in place that will manage growth and development over the next 25 to 30 years. So really value all the time that everyone's taken to think carefully and to consider those discussion questions that we posed to the group. And we'll look forward to looking through your responses after this session and presenting those back to council when we meet next in February. So we're changing gears a little bit here to present back some of what we initially thought about under those 4 themes, some of the key findings and recommendations that we'd considered that were reflected in the 4 discussion papers available on the township's website if you haven't already looked through them. And so we're going to go through sort of the Coles notes here. And then, as Steve mentioned at the outset, we'll make sure that we're leaving enough time at the end to have a general Q&A, a town hall style, so to speak, to make sure that we're giving you space to share any of your thoughts, ideas, comments, or ask questions to us too as we move through the presentation. So this first theme area is on climate change mitigation and adaptation. It's kind of a mouthful to say, but what we mean when we're talking about climate change is changes in weather patterns at local and regional levels, which include extreme weather events and increased climate variability. On all that's to say, our climate is changing. It's changing in different ways, depending on where we are in Ontario or in Canada or globally. But that as land use planners, we have a role to play in mitigating and adapting to the impacts of a changing climate. And so when we're talking about mitigation, what we're talking about is steps that a community can take to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And a way to think about that is avoiding the unmanageable. So things like reducing energy needed for buildings, transportation and waste systems, it's all with the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. When we're talking about adaptation, what we're talking about is improving a community's environmental resiliency, so managing the unavoidable. So if we know that there's going to be extreme weather events, increased climate variability, and some degree of unpredictability, what can we do to adjust natural or human-made systems in response to those anticipated effects of climate change, like an increased frequency or intensity of inclement weather, which on a day like today seems like a timely topic given the snow squalls and the snow that we've been getting this winter. Some of the key considerations that came out of our background research in looking at other jurisdictions and area municipalities in the district, other municipalities beyond in other spots in Ontario, and looking at best management practices. There's a couple that I've highlighted on the slide here that thought would be interesting to bring up for discussion, but certainly more in the report if you're keen to focus in on those. But the first one being green infrastructure. And this is something that is not new. It's already reflected in the in effect official plan, but refers to elements of the natural or the built environment that can perform that mitigation or adaptation role. So things like parks and open space, street trees, urban forests, natural heritage features and systems, so significant wetlands, significant wildlife habitat, all of those other features that Dave will mention in just a moment, and also naturalized stormwater management. So things like bioswales or other kind of approaches, green roofs, things like that can sort of mimic the natural way of absorbing water into the ground, into the earth, in a way that pavement can't. So thinking a little bit more outside the box and how we do that. The other kind of consideration is on sustainable transportation options. So recognizing that the township has a unique geography with settlement areas and built up communities that are at times a distance apart, and recognizing that being in a more rural setting makes it challenging to encourage sustainable transportation options, but as well in the places where it does make sense, encouraging those land use patterns which can reduce dependence on driving to and from a destination. So not needing to get into your car to go to the grocery store or to pick up something from the pharmacy, or not needing to get in your car to drive to work in an ideal case. As well, where we do need to get into our cars because we live in a place where that's still a reality, promoting the use of electric vehicles and charging infrastructure or other kinds of technology that can lessen the impact of driving. And when we're talking about impact there, thinking about greenhouse gas reduction. That segues nicely into our last bucket of considerations, but reducing greenhouse gas emissions from buildings. So encouraging energy efficient building design or orientation, promoting the use of renewable energy systems, whether that's for electricity or heating or cooling buildings, as well as exploring some opportunities for district energy systems. And if anyone's curious about that, happy to chat about that offline. So a brief recap of some of the things that we considered in our background research, and I'm happy to chat about that more. But in the meantime, I'll pass it over to Dave to talk about protecting the natural environment.
Thanks very much. So another one of the papers that we prepared with our consulting team with Hutchison Environmental Services really looks at the natural environment in the township. The paper focuses on the current as well as potential policies for enhancing environmental protections in the township. As you all know, the township is renowned for its natural beauty, from its landscapes, its many lakes and rivers, its forests, its rocky outcrops, and its overall rural character that leads residents to truly cherish their lives in the township and attracts visitors. The report acknowledges that these features and an overall clean environment in general are key to promoting future growth and development in the township, as well as making Lake of Bays a beautiful place to live. So this paper looks at policies for fish habitat, provincially significant wetlands, protecting wildlife habitat from the impacts of development. And key recommendations in the report include adopting a more holistic approach to protecting natural heritage as a and this might include like using a natural systems approach with updated mapping and strengthened policies. Also, where the environmental impact study is warranted to support a particular development, the report recommends providing more specific direction on the exact requirements that need to be satisfied as part of a development. So the next slide. There's also the paper regarding planning for natural hazards. The report addresses planning for and around these areas that are considered hazardous development. So this might include things such as floodplains or forests that are susceptible to wildland fire or development affected by steep slopes or perhaps properties that have narrow water bodies. So there's specific policies in the official plan that deal with these matters. And the official plan currently focuses on directing development away from natural hazards or restricting the extent of development in an area that's affected by a natural hazard. And the purpose of this is really to minimize any impacts on public health and safety or to property damage. A key finding of the report was the recommendation for updated or enhanced measures to limit and control development where appropriate in areas affected by hazards. So if you have any more questions specific to these reports on the township's, they are on the township's website, would be happy to answer any questions later. But I'll move on to the shoreline development report. Hutchison has also prepared a background discussion paper on shoreline development. This paper includes a review of the existing approach in the township to classifying lakes, to lake system health and monitoring in general, and to shoreline development standards. The goal is really to understand how the approach has been working so far in terms of protecting lakes and to identify what the township could do differently. Key findings include that the water quality in Lake of Bays remains excellent, but the health of other lakes in the township is less clear. Once again, a holistic and conservative approach is recommended to lake management, and this includes implementing best management practices for lake management. On this, it is recommended that the township continue with a science-based approach to lake health based on the District of Muskoka's Lake Health Program. I can turn it over to you for the last report, Rebecca.
Thanks, Dave. So this last discussion paper that we prepared as part of our background research focused on managing future growth and development and synthesizing everything else that we've talked about so far. There's lots to present on this. It's a really big topic. And so we've focused on picking out a few of the key findings and recommendations that we thought might be interesting to those folks on the call today. And as well as Dave mentioned, the full report is available on the township's website, and we'd be happy to answer any questions at the end of the session if you're curious about any of the recommendations that we'd put forward. So on the first topic of things, when we're doing an official plan review or preparing a new official plan in this case, part of our exercise is to look at the township's needs for land of a variety of different kinds for different uses over the long term. And so direction from the province encourages or requires planning authorities to make sure that within settlement areas or built up communities, and that would be Baysville, Dwight, Dorset, Hillside, Echo Valley, that there's sufficient land to meet long-term needs over a 20 to 30-year horizon. And that's residential land, institutional, all of those different uses that together form a complete community. And so we're looking at whether it's appropriate to propose some minor boundary adjustments in those existing built-up communities to ensure that that they reflect the needs of the township and your community over the long term, over that 20 to 30-year horizon, and reflect the on-the-ground realities of how land is being used in those communities. We also looked at the commercial designation and policies around commercial uses, looking at introducing some flexibility for commercial uses to be established outside of core areas, so those being your downtown areas or your main streets in those various communities, outside of your traditional sort of business park or plaza type developments in those existing built-up communities. So whether that means having more of a mix of compatible uses, so a mix of residential and commercial and institutional, and in various areas of the township where it makes sense, so that we can support having a complete community where you can walk to your grocery store or walk down to pick up your prescription at the pharmacy, or walk to a coffee shop or a restaurant without needing to get into your car. We also looked at a framework for identifying and protecting future employment lands or areas for manufacturing, research and development, warehousing, or goods movement, recognizing that within the newly adopted PPS, so the provincial planning statement that the province issued, that this is a heightened priority. So putting in place a framework for the township to be able to identify future lands for those different uses and to be able to protect them for employment uses over the long term, so that you have that land set aside. It won't be it'll be protected from the encroachment of potentially incompatible development. So essentially, at the end of the day, making sure that you're not putting up a whole residential neighborhood beside lands that are set aside for manufacturing or R&D or warehousing uses over the long term. And then as well, looking at promoting locally appropriate rural development outside of those existing built-up communities. So looking at rural lot standards, where there might be potential to encourage agricultural uses and on-farm diversified uses. What that means is essentially, say you have a farm property that's primarily being used for farming practices, whether that's growing crops or raising livestock, that you might be able to then have a secondary use on that property that's complementary to that primary agricultural use. So say, for example, if I own a farm property and I primarily grow crops, that I could have a farmer's market or a cafe or a restaurant or something like that that's secondary to the primary agricultural use of the property. Within home industry, that more so refers to things like carpentry shops or metalworking shops or other kinds of uses like that would be on the same property as your home, in a separate sort of building as a home-based business, and looking to see if we can introduce some flexibility and set some standards for how that might occur in the future. We also looked at the waterfront areas and looked at some policy directions that would apply township-wide as well. So thinking about how we might set standards for small or large-scale resort developments in waterfront areas to encourage both economic and environmental sustainability, and tying that into some of Hutchinson's work on shoreline development and the recommendations coming out of their work. As well, putting in place policies that could enable a township-wide community improvement plan and policies to guide a broader range of improvement projects. And for those of you that might be less familiar about what a community improvement plan does, or a CIP, essentially is a tool that municipalities can use to incentivize certain types of improvement projects, whether that's development or redevelopment in a specified area. If you have an existing building that's needing a little bit of tender love and care, those kinds of improvement projects, and using public funds under a CIP to provide grants or incentives or other kind of loans or rebates to promote that kind of development within a specified area. As well, looking at promoting the co-location of public service facilities. So things like schools, community centers, recreational facilities, so on and so forth, with parks and open space. And again, that ties back to the overarching goal of building up a complete community so that folks have the opportunity to get between those different public places on foot, on a bike, on a skateboard, a scooter, wheelies. I might be aging myself there, but that it's close in close proximity, so that you have that complete community kind of vibe. And then the last, but certainly not least, reflecting on some new policy direction from the newly adopted provincial planning statement for development on partial or private water and sewage systems in existing built communities. There's been some really significant changes with the new PPS, and that might have some implications on some of the built up communities where there aren't full municipal water and sewage services. And so trying to think carefully about how we can reflect that new provincial direction while still providing for the types of development that the township needs over the long term within that kind of framework and hierarchy of partial or private services. So I know I promised there'd be no quiz, and there's no quiz, but I wanted to just wrap up with some final thoughts. I know that's a lot of information to digest in a fairly short time frame, but wanting to share on some of the next steps that we have in the project, and then as promised, have a good chunk of time towards the end of the session. We have until about 3 o'clock together to go through some question and answer, just town hall style. But before we get to that, some of our next steps. So as Dave mentioned before, we're looking forward to drafting those policy directions, consolidating the feedback that we get from today's session with on those proposed policy directions, some of the feedback that we got from the stakeholder focus groups that we held last week, and packaging this all together in a series of recommendations that we can put forward to council before we start drafting the new official plan. And then our work will be cut out for us in phases 4 and 5 to prepare that new official plan for the township based on the recommendations that we put forward, the direction that we received from township council and staff, as well as from members of the community, and when we're ready to host a public a public open house rather, to sit down and chat about, when we have a plan in hand about where it needs tweaking to really fit with your vision for your community over the long term. And then in that last phase, phase 5, finalizing the official plan to reflect that public feedback and stakeholder input that we receive in that open house, so that as we're preparing the final official plan and presenting that to council for their consideration, that it reflects what you want for your community. The last step, as you've noted earlier, is approval by the district. So once the plan is adopted by Township Council, the official plan would then be submitted to the district for final approval. And I'll pass it over here to Dave to chat through some future opportunities for public engagement.
Sure. Thanks very much, Rebecca. So we just wanted to take this opportunity to thank you all for attending. This has been, the participations today has been really valuable. And as Rebecca noted, we're going to be taking the feedback we get from you into heart as we draft some policy directions over the next coming weeks. There are some upcoming future opportunities for to be involved. And as Rebecca mentioned, we'll reopen the questions if you had other things you wanted to type as well. Or, there's our email addresses are on the slide as well. If you have other thoughts throughout this process that you'd like to take some time and think about your responses, feel free to send us an email as well. We'll be taking letters, emails from the public on your ideas and your recommended policy directions for the official plan over the next coming months. So with that said, we are preparing for a council presentation. It will be both you can attend in person at the council chambers, or you can participate by Zoom. And we'll be presenting, as you've heard today, the results of the research of these preliminary background papers that are available on the township's website, and looking at key themes from the initial activities we've heard that we've had so far with the public, and that includes this public information center. It also includes the stakeholder focus groups that we've already held. And in the future, we will be looking to hold an open house over the summer when the most amount of seasonal residents are in Lake of Bays, to reach the highest number of people possible. So we plan to come in person. Hopefully we'll get a little bit of time to enjoy the beauty of Lake of Bays, but we definitely will be, at a town hall type of setting, or we don't know where the venue will be. So stay tuned. We'll give you some more details. But that open house is typically a less formal opportunity for you to come and view the draft official plan policies, look at the draft official plan mapping, and to just chat with us over a cup of coffee or some donuts about the sorts of things that you think need to be changed in the draft, or just ask questions about the project in general. Once we've had that open house, we'll review the feedback that we receive and start preparing for a public meeting to present a final draft of the official plan for council to consider. And as Rebecca noted in the previous slide, the last step is for that adopted official plan to be submitted to the District of Muskoka so that they can make a decision on it. And I think there's one more slide. So yeah, I'll turn it back over to you, Rebecca, I think, for this one. And we can talk a little bit about what we're going to do over the next hour or so.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, Dave. So I have one more poll question for folks before we move into the town hall style of the presentation. So curious to see what questions you have coming out of today's session based on the information that we presented. If things didn't make sense, or either myself, Dave, April, or other township staff said something that sparked an idea in your mind that oh, what if this or that? Anything that comes out of today's session that you'd like some more clarity on. And I'll give everyone about 2-ish minutes if you have any questions. And if you don't, that's okay too. Seeing a couple of responses trickle in here. Right, I'll give a 30-second heads up before we close that poll and move to the final question, just before we move to a town hall style Q&A. All right, looks like a couple of those responses just trickled in here. Seeing that slow down, April, maybe we can close that poll and move on to the next one. Thanks. So this next question, along the same vein, same kind of question, just framed in a little bit of a different way. But curious to see what final thoughts you'd like to leave us, so JLR and the township, to consider as we move forward with crafting the new official plan for the township. And that's purposely open-ended, can be anything and everything. And I'll give you a couple of minutes to reflect on that and put your responses in there. I'll give folks probably 3, 4, 5 minutes. This one's a bit of a meatier question before we move on to Q&A. I'll give you the 1 minute heads up if you have some thoughts that you still want to add. Still seeing some responses trickle in. We'll leave this question up for just another minute before we move on. Right, 5-second countdown. It looks like a couple of people are still sneaking their responses in here. All right, we'll close down that poll. And just before we break into the Q&A portion of today's session, just wanted to take a moment to thank you for your time and attention today. I feel very grateful to have spent this hour with you so far, to have a community that's so engaged and paying attention and so passionate about the direction for their community. It's really a pleasure to see and a pleasure to work with the township and with a community that's so engaged. I'll pass it over to April to give some final thank yous, and then we'll move over into the Q&A. And I'll give a bit of a refresher on how that's going to work just after April's spoken.
Definitely. Thanks, Rebecca. So thanks again to all of you for participating today and then again for the next hour or so and providing your valuable feedback to help shape the future of the township. So as mentioned previously, this is the first of several public sessions regarding the official plan. So there will be additional opportunities to provide your input as we move forward with the next phases of the project, and we encourage you to join us at those future sessions. Also, as mentioned previously, this meeting recording will will be made available for those unable to attend or for those who wish to rewatch it again in the future. Also, if you have any questions or comments throughout the process following today's session, please feel free to reach out to myself or the project team at any time to, again, have that conversation via email, phone, in person, whatever you prefer.
Thanks so much, April. So just a quick note of reminder for how we'll do this Q&A session. It works a little bit differently on a virtual setting than if we were in person. But if you note at the bottom of your screen, there's a raised hand function. So you'll see that I just clicked that button, got a hand raised here, and then there's a little button at the bottom where I can lower my hand once I've spoken. So we'll open the floor up to a general Q&A. If you have questions for us, if you have some comments that you'd like to share, some feedback, ideas, thoughts for us to consider as we move forward with the project that you'd like to voice in person rather than through the poll, I'd encourage that now, and we'll see who the brave person is to start things off. I'm always grateful to the first. It's never easy to break the ice. I see that Fraser has raised his hand. I'll yield the floor to you.
Hi. Hi, everyone. You alluded to provincial policy statement changes in 2024 regarding partial or private water sewage systems. What can you expand on that? Like, what were some of the key changes?
Yeah, that's a great question, Fraser. I can maybe start off with it and then pass it to April to elaborate on it. But essentially, in the PPS, there's always been a hierarchy of specifically within settlement areas. So your built-up communities, that would be Baysville, Dwight, Dorset, Hillside, where you have a concentration of uses to prioritize first and foremost development that occurs on full municipal services. So municipal water, municipal sewer, then to prioritize, okay, if that's not available or feasible, then to prioritize private communal services. So rather than individual property owners having individual systems that say you're in a planned community, you're on a communal system, that would be a priority, or that would be sort of the next option. Or if you had partial services, so say you had water, municipal water, but you didn't have municipal sewer, so you're on a septic tank, or vice versa. Maybe you have municipal sewer, but you don't have municipal water, so you're on a well. And then the last kind of rung of hierarchy would be to have sort of fully private services that are individual to your lot. So that would be in more of those rural areas where you have only private individual wells and private individual septic systems. Does that part make sense?
Well, it makes sense. I'm just wondering. I mean, in the past, there's been, I guess, a reluctance to have, multi-unit development on a private communal system.
Right.
And I didn't know if that's going away or if that's going to be made easier for developers to do. I just wanted to get more of an understanding of what the trend was.
For sure. So one of the key changes that a lot of communities across Ontario are still grappling with, given that the PPS is still quite new. It was passed in August of last year and came into effect in October of last year, is a shift in direction on partial servicing. So that situation that I mentioned where you have municipal water but not sewer, or you have municipal sewer and not water. So there's been a change where in the past there wasn't, I guess in the future in PPS 2024, there's preference given to municipal sewage that's supported by a private well, and less support for the opposite of that. So less support for the scenario where you have municipal water, but you don't have municipal sewage, that you'd be on a private sewage system. And maybe Dave, you could jump in here.
Sure. I was just going to mention that, and yeah, the policies on communal servicing are really remain the same. So they're still permitted, but as you mentioned, Fraser, a lot of municipalities are hesitant to go that route because of concerns about what happens if the system defaults. There's a bit of a rush or a trend, I would say, maybe not a rush. Several municipalities that are exploring ways to make communal servicing more palatable to both the municipality and the developer, and we're monitoring that discussion as part of this to see if there's some sort of policy change that may make that more of interest to a municipality. But we're the, but yeah, essentially the partial servicing has been opened up is only for situations where there's municipal sewage but private water, which doesn't really help the specific settlement areas in Lake Bays.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, that gives me more information. Thank you.
No problem.
Um, Linda, I see your hands up as well. Did you have a question to pose?
Yes, and I'm look again, it's a provincial policy statement change. I'm looking at the managing future growth, the recommendation on page 24 in regards to the establishment of new settlement areas and the expanding existing settlement areas outside of a complete official plan review. And I appreciate you provide comments there about policies having to be developed and how that would work. Could you just provide an outline or some comments how you would think that process would work outside of a detailed official plan review?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Linda. It's something that is a complicated kind of question to grapple with, but there's a couple of moving pieces that maybe I'll comment on that might pull some context together. So with this new PPS that was passed in 2024, it represents an amalgamation of the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe, which primarily affects development in Southern Ontario and doesn't affect development outside of that area. And the PPS that was in effect in 2020 that guided municipal decision making up until this point. And so with the amalgamation of those two documents into the new PPS that now impacts decision making across Ontario, there's certain pieces of both of those documents that have been pulled from each of those contexts that are now affecting land use planning across Ontario. So that's one piece to the puzzle. The PPS does outline several criteria that must be met to the municipality's satisfaction when they're considering boundary expansion requests or when they're considering requests for the establishment of a new settlement area. And when we're talking about that, I mean privately initiated requests. So somebody that is not representing the municipality comes to the table to say, I'm interested in this piece of development. It's not within your settlement area, so the policies are a little bit less flexible on what I can do with that property. Maybe, can I put in a request to expand that boundary to include the property that I own? And then that in some cases, then there's different policies to consider to weigh the merits of that development and certain tests that we would evaluate development against, depending on whether it's in a settlement area or not in a settlement area. And so essentially what the new PPS is doing is taking what used to be in the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe that previously, prior to the PPS 2024, that any of those sorts of requests within the Greater Golden Horseshoe would have to be addressed through a comprehensive official plan review or a similar kind of exercise. Now that those two policy documents have merged into one document, being the PPS 2024, there's certain bits and pieces that that affect planning, land use planning in Southern Ontario that are now impacting communities across Ontario, including the Lake of Bays. So it's a long-winded way of answering your question, and I hope that it's helpful. But in areas outside of the Greater Golden Horseshoe, there have always been a sort of set of policies or directions on how to assess those privately initiated requests. But now that those documents have merged, we're seeing that direction coming from the PPS more strongly.
I understand. I guess what I'm thinking of is if it is outside of a comprehensive review, will there be policies? It would be then outside of straight planning proposal brought forward. There would be additional requirements.
Yes. So if, say, a private citizen were to come forward to the township with a proposal to either expand settlement area boundaries or to establish a new settlement area, there would be an application process that would have strict requirements that would be laid out in the official plan, and those requirements would have to be met, and township staff and council would have to be satisfied that those requirements were met in accordance with the requirements of the Planning Act, the PPS, the district's plan, and the township's plan before moving forward.
So it would be a specific planning process in addition to, so I want to take 80 acres and put subdivisions on it and have my own water system. No way that I do, but that type of proposal was brought forward. There would be not just a subdivision type, because it was an expansion to or a new settlement area, it would require a very specific process.
Yes and no. And it's really context dependent.
Yeah, okay.
So, and maybe Dave, I can pass it over to you or to April to respond as well. But essentially, if the way that the PPS directs municipalities to plan for lands, there's kind of a set of rules that apply to settlement areas, a set of rules that apply to rural settlement areas where there aren't full municipal services, a set of rules that apply to rural lands where they're sort of those in-between lands that aren't serviced and aren't within a settlement area, and then a set of rules that apply to territory without municipal organization. So if you think in some spots in Northern Ontario, further north of Lake of Bays, where there isn't a township doing land use planning, where there isn't municipal organization in the sense of having a municipality, each of those different scenarios has a different set of rules on what they can do with those lands. And so when you're thinking about, say, putting together a plan of subdivision, depending on where that plan of subdivision is, if it's within a settlement area, there's a certain set of rules and policies that would be guided. If it's outside of a settlement area, there might be a different set of rules and policies that would guide it. And if you're wanting to apply the rules that apply to settlement areas to that case where you're outside of a settlement area, this privately initiated boundary request could be one way that you could accomplish that. But to your original question, yes, it would be a process over and above just applying for a plan of subdivision. Does that answer your question?
I think so. What I guess, looking for is that there is a set guidelines in regards to public consultation in a comprehensive review, and they are much higher than just an application. So I'm just looking at the public consultation process, I guess, is much more rigorous than on a individual application.
Yes. David, looks like you were going to add something.
Yeah, unfortunately, the requirements for public consultation would be exactly the same as, say, any application to amend the official plan. So if you wanted to add lands to, let's say, Baysville, it would have to go through an official plan amendment and a zoning or a community planning permit amendment bylaw process. And so there would be a public meeting requirement and public notice requirement under the Planning Act for those processes. The set of criteria that Rebecca mentioned for privately initiated expansions to the settlement area is not dissimilar to the previous test in the PBS, whereby the applicant will the expansion of a settlement area will still need to satisfy the municipality that there's sufficient infrastructure and servicing to service that additional land. So there's still a list of tests in the provincial planning statement that we would carry forth to the draft official plan in conjunction with, in collaboration with district and township staff, of course. But unfortunately, there's no specific, additional public engagement process other than what's in the Planning Act for an official plan amendment or a zoning amendment.
So the public notice would just be to what's required currently under the Planning Act to local, as opposed to, although township staff could take the initiative to provide further public notice?
Yeah, for the Planning Act still requires applicants for official plan amendments to include a public engagement strategy. So I would, and maybe April can jump in if I missed the mark, but I would imagine that would be one of the expectation is that the applicant would have to identify how they're going to engage their neighbors if they brought forth such a proposal.
Thank you. I think I'm sure it wouldn't just be neighbors if it was something that large. The public notice strategy would be required to be larger. Thank you. That does answer.
Thanks for that question, Linda. I also see Tim, you have your hand up. Tim, do you want to jump in?
Yes, thanks. The shoreline paper talks about redevelopment of existing properties presenting a larger stress on the lake than future development, and points out that policies for limiting impacts associated with existing development are generally sparse and not often enforced. And then it talks about the pressures coming from what we all can see around the lake: larger cottages, more permanent residency, manicured lawns, extensive landscaping, and reiterates the impact that has for the natural shoreline in the lake. And then goes on to talk about how to address this by saying that it's recommended that the township adopt or incorporate a similar science-based lake management approach to what's set out in the 2015 district plan, with an emphasis on best management practices and an updated understanding of stressors on lake environments and tools available to manage and mitigate those impacts. So that statement about the general approach, I'd like to get a little bit of a better understanding of what that means, because it would seem that the kinds of things that need to be addressed in policies would be things like vegetation buffers, setback from the water, building size, standards for land use, including lawns and permeability of driveways, how to deal with non-compliant properties, more enforcement of standards. Those seem to be the types of things that would be responsive to the problems that have been identified. So I'm trying to understand whether those types of things are included in the concept of incorporating a similar science-based lake management approach. Like what does a science-based lake management approach mean in terms of the eventual outcome for standards for existing development changes?
Sure, and I can maybe take a crack at this question first and then pass it over to Dave or April. So the Hutchinson team is their background and specialties in environmental science. So their expertise is in that area, whereas ours is in land use planning. But if I can speak generally to some of the comments that you made around the implementation tools, so vegetative buffers, the setbacks from the waterfront, things like permeable surfaces, those green infrastructure pieces, all of those have their place in the land use planning framework. And what I'm hearing from your question is, where do they fit in? And so when we're doing an official plan, we're looking at the high level vision for the community, looking at, as Dave mentioned earlier, the matters of provincial interest that are specified, policy direction in the provincial planning statement, but also the district's official plan, looking at the current policies of the township's official plan and what we're hearing from stakeholders, and kind of pulling that all together in the context of your best management practices or emerging practices from other municipalities. There's a kind of dance, so to speak, between your official plan and your zoning bylaw, or in the Lake of Bays with your community planning permit bylaw. And so there's certain aspects that you can implement as directions to have a bit more flexibility, or to say, you know, generally speaking, when new development on the shoreline comes forward, these are the things that we'd like to see addressed. And that's something that the community endorses, council endorses, as sort of your vision statement and clear policy to implement that. The next step, once you have your official plan in place, is to have that implementation tool. And there's a variety of different tools that are in a municipality's toolkit to have that on the ground effect that I think you're referencing. So say your shoreline buffers, or your setbacks from waterfront, or your max lot coverage, your green development standards, if we want to call it that, encouraging things like permeable surfaces on driveways, or other things like that that will have a positive impact on lake system health. Those are different things that some of them can be implemented by a zoning bylaw or by the community permit planning bylaw, that when an application comes in, say somebody wants to do something, they go to the building department, that bylaw essentially says, okay, these are the checklists of things based on the zone that you're in that we need to look at. Do you meet the lot coverage? Do you meet your setbacks? Do you meet your frontage requirements, your area requirements, X, Y, Z? And then if you do meet all those requirements, here's your building permit, and you go through that process. And if you don't, then there's sort of additional work to be done to recognize, say if you have a deficiency, whether that's over your lot coverage, or you're proposing to build too close to the water course, or any number of things, that those can be addressed through other planning tools, like, for example, a minor variance, a zoning bylaw amendment, or other kinds of instruments. And the authority rests with the local municipality to implement those tools. So it's easier in the sense that you're then going to township council, requesting consideration of those matters, and coming back, relatively speaking, a little bit more quickly than if you were to seek an official plan amendment, then going through township council, going through district council, and the different layers of proposing an official plan amendment. That's quite a bit more of an onerous process. So having that dance between those two documents, recognizing, okay, this is the place where we set the vision with a mind to how we'll implement those different objectives, but there are other tools in the municipality's toolkit, so to speak, like the community planning permit bylaw, that will come later to implement these directions. You know, it's a really long-winded response to your question, and maybe Dave or April, you can jump in, but was that, is that helpful, Tim?
Well, I think I do understand what you've just said, and it's a process that is not in every respect getting these issues addressed the way that they need to be addressed. And one of the ways that by setting standards that are more protective, and one of the ways that it's been pointed out that issue can be better looked after, is by having more effective protective language in the official plan, and having an implementation plan that provides a framework for township considerations, and amongst other things allows the township to take more protective actions in circumstances where they think that it's warranted on the basis that would comply with the general direction in the official plan. So it's important for the official plan to deal well and robustly with these issues. And it's not only a question, this goes back to your comment about the dance. There's the need for the dance to be done well between the documents and in the township, but the official plan has to do its robust part to deal with these challenges to the lake's environment. I don't want us to miss the opportunity to get the official plan to deal well with these issues on the basis that this kind of issue could be addressed by the township. And it's not that it can't be, but the official plan has to do its part because it sets the framework for the township, both in terms of providing tools, but also providing standards and expectations for how the township is going to make decisions in individual applications.
Absolutely. And I appreciate you clarifying that, Tim. I think the strength in good policy, and especially within an official plan, is that it's clear, it's concise, and that there's a view to how it could be implemented. Those are the three things that I'm thinking about when I'm developing policy. And so I'm glad that you raised that. And it is a bit of a dance between those two documents, and not just the community planning permit bylaw, but also other tools that the municipality has at their disposal. But ultimately, all of those feed into the official plan. And you're right, it's up to us, and we have a job ahead of us to make sure that you do have that strong policy basis and those protective policies around shoreline development to ensure that that when those various applications come in, that you have tests to weigh them against, and you have strong policy to make sure that that vision and those objectives of protecting the shoreline and protecting the natural environment are weighed appropriately against the interests of development. Dave, did you want to add anything, or April, did you want to jump in here?
I think you've covered my thoughts on the matter quite well.
Yes,
Okay.
I agree. Rebecca, great job.
Tim, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Tim. I also see, Rick, you have your hand up. Did you have a comment or question to share? So you maybe lowered your hand. I'll go to Catherine first, and then I'll come back to you, Rick. Go ahead, Catherine.
Hello, and thank you very much for having this process. So one of the questions I have, maybe it builds on the last discussion, is how much teeth does the official plan come? Because this is, I guess, a municipal plan. When it comes up against the province and I'm thinking back to the Ontario Municipal Board. I think it's called something else now. So when they are in conflict, and this has happened, I know, in the township of Dwight in regards to a quarry development, how can we give it more teeth, or how does it coordinate with the province? Like what takes priority? You know, you've got a grassroots municipality, does all this consultation for a wonderful official plan, and then the province comes, you know, sometimes with a unilateral one person, you know, that's what the municipal board used to have, that could potentially override an official plan. So how official, how legally binding, how much meat does it have?
That's a great question, Catherine, and it's something that I think we grapple with on a day-to-day basis as land use planners. But the short answer to your question, and I'll try to keep it as short as I can, is essentially, as Dave mentioned at the outset of our presentation today, the authority for land use planning rests with the province, with the Planning Act. And if you're paying attention to the news, you might notice that over the last couple of months, over the last couple of years, there have been quite a few changes to the Planning Act that have direct impact on how municipalities can plan for land use and development and growth over the long term in their planning tools, and including in official plans. So that's kind of one piece to things. But what I heard from your question was, okay, where does it fit within the grand scheme of things, and whose takes priority over whose? And so the provincial planning statement is essentially the guidebook, so to speak, that the province issues to say, this is how we want municipalities to plan for land within their jurisdiction, or in the case of unorganized territories, how to plan for land within a planning area. If you look at the language, it's in some senses restrictive, in other senses gives more flexibility. And the job of municipalities is to take that direction and think about, okay, based on the local geography, based on what I know members of the community want and need, based on what all these different factors that come together, how can I put together a plan that is consistent with that provincial direction, but also meets the needs of my local community? And it's finding that middle ground to then, through the planning process and through the process of developing an official plan that guides land use planning decisions, growth and development over a 20 to 30-year horizon. How do I strike that balance? But you're right, when it comes time to, say, an appeal, for instance, and the OMB has been replaced by the LPAT, but that was short-lived. It's now the Ontario Land Tribunal. When it comes time for an appeal to be resolved, it's the PPS or the Planning Act that takes precedence over the local plan. And it's up to qualified experts. And that can be land use planners, that can be lawyers or other allied professionals, to make the case of whether the intent and purpose of the local plan was upheld with whatever decision, and weighing that against the strength of the language in the PPS and in the Planning Act, teasing out those areas where there is more rigidity or more flexibility, and finding that middle ground. So it's certainly not a straightforward response, but does that sort of start to answer your question?
Yeah, that's helpful. I'm just wondering, in terms of process, as part of developing the official plan, is there some kind of coordination with the province? And is there any potential to put more weight on municipalities who go through these incredible processes to consult with people who live there? So I just, wondering about that piece.
Sure. I can answer that a bit, and then I'll pass it to Dave, who has a bit more insight into the provincial government. But essentially, we're working quite closely with the district municipality of Muskoka to, if you think of them almost as a middleman, or the point between the province and the township. Because ultimately, it's the district municipality of Muskoka that will have the final say on approving the official plan that's put in place for the township. So we've set out our work plan to engage with folks around the table in sessions like this, but to also engage with the district early on, so that we're on the same page throughout, so that hopefully once it comes time to putting forward a new official plan for council's consideration, and then for the district's consideration, that they've been engaged throughout the process, and they're that hopefully, if all goes to plan, we're on the same page when we get to that process. And Dave, maybe I'll point it to you to talk about the authority, but essentially, in other places where you don't have a two-tier system, where you have just one municipality that doesn't have a district or a region to report to, typically it would be the Ministry of Municipal Affairs that would have that role and having the final say on approving an official plan. So, say for example, in the city of Guelph, where I live, the city of Guelph is a single tier municipality. So rather than have them having a district or a region to report to, when they prepare an official plan that's local to the city of Guelph, it's the Ministry of Municipal Affairs that has the authority to approve or make modifications to that plan. But Dave has some experience from working at MMH that maybe he'd be able to share.
Sure, yeah. I worked in the northern office in Sudbury and in northern Ontario, just north of the neighbors of Lake of Bays. So that's Armour and Kearney and Burkes Falls. All those official plans are approved directly by the province. In Muskoka, the province approves the District of Muskoka's official plan, and the concept is the District of Muskoka official plan is consistent with the PPS. Therefore, the province really doesn't need to get involved in the lower tier official plans. The assumption being that those lower tier official plans will conform with the Muskoka official plan, which is consistent, and then everyone is consistent with the provincial planning statement. So that's kind of the thinking there. So we don't anticipate the Ministry of Municipal Affairs having a role. They may issue a comment letter if they see something egregiously inconsistent with the provincial planning statement. But most of the official plans I work on in this neck of the woods, we won't receive direct comments from them. We'll work closely with the district and we'll provide them with a draft of the official plan that they can comment on and make sure we're not missing anything vis-a-vis the provincial planning statement. Hopefully the end result will be that we won't have a official plan that doesn't align with the PPS. That is the goal.
Does that answer your question, Catherine?
Somewhat. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for that question, Catherine. I see that Fraser, you have your hand up again. Not sure if had you lowered it or did you have another question or comment to share with the group? Go ahead, Fraser. Maybe not. I'll circle back to Fraser in just a moment. Rick, I see you have your hand up. Did you want to add in something? And then we can come back to Fraser in just a moment. The floor is yours, Rick, if you're able to unmute and ask your question.
Is that better?
Yep,
Yeah.
I can hear you now.
Excellent. I've never been accused of being quiet, so. I wanted to quickly follow up on one of Tim's comments. Following a science-based approach has merit, as long as there is yin and yang, enforcement or deterrence, such as we have an AMPS program, which could be considered to be included in this regard with our existing bylaws, if planning was to suggest it, because as has been pointed out before, if you have these requirements in the official plan that you should do this, you should not do this, and people insist on doing what they're not supposed to do, there's not much of a slap on the wrist without having them pay the price. So we really need to make sure that there's our tools are there for them to be able to enforce what is being asked for in our land use policies and in our official plan and good planning, basically, I guess, is where we're going with. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure, and thanks for that comment, Rick. There's a couple of things I heard from your comment. The first being the science-based approach that Tim had mentioned. The second being, okay, so you have this official plan, how do you implement it? And then the third being, where's that balance between having an implementation tool and having it be an effective implementation tool that actually deters folks or encourages folks towards the outcome that you have outlined in the official plan. So I'll speak to those in that order. The first being the science-based approach that I didn't touch on too much, and Tim brought it up. So I'm glad that you brought it up again. It's something that I'm not an expert in, but the Hutchinson team looked at lake system health from a holistic perspective. So looking at the different stressors that are on lakes, whether that be from development or other factors, and recognizing that our thinking around lake system health has really evolved over time. And so, taking off my expert hat for a second and putting on my land use planning hat to kind of translate the findings of that discussion paper, what I take away from it is that increasingly the impacts of a changing climate have impact on lake system health to a greater degree than we might have recognized in decades past. And so what I interpret from that paper is that, as we're moving forward with implementing your best management practices, that those also have to consider the impacts of a changing climate and other stressors that might be put on lakes. That it's not only development and lake capacity that we need to be worried about. So that's one piece to it. The other thing that I heard from your comment is that that interplay between enforcement and effective enforcement, and having the tools in the toolkit, so to speak, to make sure that, at the end of the day, once we have an official plan that we can all agree on, that the community is satisfied, that will guide appropriate growth and development over the next 20, 30 years, that you do have the tools in place to implement that vision. And so when you look to something like the community permit bylaw, that's one tool, but that's not necessarily every tool that the municipality or the township in this case has in their toolkit. And what's exciting about working in a community like Lake of Bays is it's one of the few municipalities in Ontario that have used a community planning permit bylaw. Traditionally, you'll hear Dave and I kind of going back and forth in our terminology that we sometimes call it a zoning bylaw. We sometimes call it a community planning permit bylaw. It's a bit of a mouthful, but in most other municipalities, you have an official plan and a zoning bylaw. And it's only been fairly recently that the Planning Act changed to allow for a tool like the community planning permit bylaw to streamline the process, to put tools into a sort of consolidated set. And really, Lake of Bays is one of the few municipalities. There's a couple others that have introduced a similar system, but really leading the charge, so to speak, or really setting quite a leadership role amongst other municipalities across Ontario to be taking that approach and taking that authority that rests in the Planning Act and implementing it on the ground. The last point that I want to address in your comment is around the effectiveness of implementation tools. And it's a comment that is not uncommon in these kinds of conversations when we're dealing with protecting things like the natural environment or the shoreline environment. That yes, while we want to have those implementation tools in the municipality's toolkit so they can pull those out and implement them as they need to, you have to know that that tool is going to be effective at either encouraging the type of development or behavior that you want to see, or on the other side, discouraging the type of behavior that you don't want to see. And that'll be something that, as we're crafting policy, we'll have in mind to having clear policy, concise policy that can be implemented with a mind to the different tools in the municipality's toolkit, so that those tools are effective tools at implementing the vision that's in the OP. April, did you have anything to add on that, or Dave? Does that answer your question, Rick?
It's I guess that's the best we can do right now. The difficulty we have is when you see a property that has been decimated contrary to the way it should be. You can't put the trees back. You can't put the landscape back. You've got to basically make them recognize that we got to have the tools there so that we can make them recognize they have done something wrong, and having them say, well, sorry, that's just not enough. But anyway, I guess if I was to kind of segue from that for a little bit or for a moment, uh, I spent last week at Roma, or with Roma, or at Roma, I should say, and one of the sessions that I sat in on was land use planning in a rural perspective, and the comment made there was very relevant to what we're talking about here, and that is in regards to PPS 2024. The statement made by the moderator was, with over 440 municipalities in Ontario, there's no one size fits all.
Mhm.
And they were encouraging planners across the province to recognize these differences and have flexibility in your interpretations. So I would just
Absolutely.
like to make sure that that's something that's being taken to heart with doing this report and doing, I mean, just basically from a planner's perspective, that there's not always, it's going back to what you said earlier, Rebecca, it's not always black and white.
Mhm.
There are some gray areas, and sometimes we live in those gray areas. So anyway, that's it. Thank you very much for the great presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Rick, and thanks for those comments. I think it's a great segue. I see a couple of hands, so happy to stay beyond three to hear those comments, but appreciate that sentiment. I think if I can speak from a personal perspective, more and more, a lot of land use planning is in that gray, that there isn't a black or white. And for me, that's part of the joy of being in this profession, that we get to work so closely with communities to understand um, when we are in those gray areas, how you want us to proceed and what makes sense from a variety of different stakeholders' perspectives to put a plan in place to guide those decisions long after we're gone. So thanks for that comment, Rick. I'll go back to Fraser, see if you're able to unmute yourself.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Can you hear me?
I hear you just fine.
Okay. I want to bring up the subject of granny flats, or I call them granny flats. I guess other people call them secondary suites. And I'm looking at this from a point of view of, the Ministry of Health and Policy is saying, more and more people want to age in place. They want to age at their property, and maybe that entails having, a nurse come in periodically, or a homemaker, or help, to enable the aging in place. And, we see these garden suites or secondary units. Currently, I believe they're not permitted in the waterfront zone. And I didn't know if that was an official plan, or is that more the community planning permit bylaw? Like I'm want to say, if we want to encourage people to age in place, and it requires a granny flat, and the property just happens to be in the waterfront zone, where does this get dealt with? Is that something that needs to be covered in the official plan, or is that something that's covered in the community planning permit?
Yeah, I can speak to that first, and then maybe I'll pass it to Dave to add some comments afterwards. But essentially, what you're talking about with granny suites, or some people call them secondary dwellings or additional residential units, there's a lot of different terms that talk about the same concept. When we're looking at more rural areas like Lake of Bays, to others' comments before, what Rick was mentioning, having that locally appropriate focus to make sure that we're planning appropriately. That comes down to thinking about, okay, when you have limited services, and maybe those are private services, a well and a septic system in the rural area, so outside of the waterfront area, or then when you have areas that are in the waterfront area where you're again on private services, so a well and septic, considering the impact that increasing density, so having more people, more buildings, more structures in the same unit of land will have on the natural environment. And so in the waterfront areas along shorelines in particular, what we have to balance is, okay, is recognizing that there is a benefit, as you point out, to aging in place, having to balance that as well with the obligations that we have to protect and plan for the natural environment and make sure that growth and development and increasing density is appropriate and won't have adverse impacts on the natural environment over the long term. So it kind of ties back to what we were talking about earlier with putting together a set of standards for shoreline development. In other jurisdictions, typically in the waterfront area, having additional residential units or granny suites is typically not permitted because of that sensitivity of the natural environment and of the adjacent water. Where there is more flexibility is, say, in rural areas away from the waterfront, or even greater flexibility within urban or suburban land. So especially where there are full municipal services, where there's capacity within existing municipal infrastructure, the province has essentially said, regardless of what local planning authorities might have in their official plans or their zoning bylaws or their community planning permit bylaws, you can have 3 units as of right, or that number has changed over time, but essentially in a variety of different configurations. So it's trying to understand and recognize within each of those different settings where you have different constraints and different priorities to balance, what's appropriate in one setting might not be what's appropriate in another setting, having to weigh those costs and benefits, so to speak, to make sure that overall we've considered all of the different factors that need to come into play to support that goal of aging in place. Dave, maybe I can pass it to you to speak more to that on ARUs in the waterfront area.
Can I just comment on what you've said?
Sure.
We see more and more larger waterfront development or redevelopment going on. I mean, it's not uncommon now to see a footprint of 5,000 or 6,000 square feet, property, or not property, but cottage, and then they've got a 2,000 square foot boathouse and dock, and then they've got a tennis court or a pickleball court. And I guess what I would like to say is maybe there should be some flexibility at the OP or the CPP to have these granted, suites, but make it each one stand on its own merits. I mean, you talk about density. I mean, the sizes of the buildings that are being built these days is just, they're not cottages anymore. They're estates on the waterfront. And I'm just saying that, in order to, try to live in your house as long as possible, maybe we have to have a change in thinking about how we look at each case individually.
That's a great comment, and appreciate you for clarifying that, Fraser. I think it's really important. What I'm hearing from your comment is that aging in place is something that's really important, and I agree with that sentiment as well. That to think creatively and sort of out of the box at how we can support that, given the pressures from other development that we're seeing, especially along the waterfront area, to make sure that that's a priority in the plan. That's something that we can consider. But Dave, wanted to pass it to you if you had any other thoughts to add.
Well, I'm just taking some general notes. I'm sure it'll come up in the comments too. But yeah, I mean, there's lots of municipalities out there that have, instead of say a blanket prohibition on additional residential units in a waterfront area, they may have it by lot area or lot coverage, and if the lot coverage can be met, and then maybe it's not prohibited. There's other, the other thing is, can we guarantee that the septic system isn't going to have a negative impact on lake capacity? So maybe in situations where we have accurate, up-to-date information on lake capacity, maybe that's a good opportunity to have some additional flexibility. So these are all things we could definitely explore through this review. And so thanks very much for that question. I don't know if you.
Well, if we had an ample quantity of retirement homes in Baysville or around Muskoka, maybe it wouldn't be an issue. But I mean, the bottom line is there's not enough capacity for the seniors, going forward 10 years. Where are they going to live? And if they can't live at home, they're going to have to leave Muskoka or go somewhere else.
Absolutely. And I think especially your comments are timely and where we're at right now with the baby boomer generation, you know, population demographics trending towards an older population, that these are absolutely the things that we'll need to be grappling with in our land use planning decisions. So appreciate your comments. Thanks, Fraser.
Thank you for letting me speak.
Absolutely. I see that Linda has her hand up. We're at about 3:05. If there is anybody else that has thoughts or comments that you want to add, I'll just ask you to put your hand up just so I can have a gauge on time. Appreciate the discussion and all the conversation that's happening around the table. This is really great to see. So I see Linda has her hand up and Jacqueline, and then maybe we'll move to close if there aren't any other questions or comments from folks, if that's okay with you, April. Okay, perfect. So
good.
I'll go to Linda first and then to Jacqueline.
Thank you, Rebecca. Just building on Fraser's questions, I did have comments I was going to provide into regards to granny flats and also multi-generational homes. And whether it's not just lakeshore or its land requirements, I think there's areas that we could build on this in the community. But when I think of multi-generational homes, from my own perspective, I have family members waiting for long-term care, and I have a multi-generational home. And one of the things that we have when we have a multi-generational home is that we can't have a second kitchen. I understand why people may turn those into rental units and things that we don't want. But when we have a multi-generational home and we have trying to give older parents or relatives a place in our own home, a septic system has been built for those requirements, for those amount of bedrooms, and building permits are required. So I think in some areas a policy should be available to consider that. I also support granny flats. As Fraser noted, we have these massive homes and those septic systems are built to accommodate those bedrooms. So if we have someone living in place, there is probably already a bedroom, bathroom facilities to accommodate those people and individuals. And it may already be happening in some of those larger homes. But I think granny flats, even on larger, maybe they're not, they wouldn't be lakefront, but rural lots, multi-residential, smaller units, the granny flats, there's been other names for them, but I do support that. And I think when we're looking at, as our community is aging, that we look to support those in our policies. Thank you.
Thanks for those comments, Linda. And one thing that I heard from what you were sharing and that I'd like to touch on just for the last few minutes that we have together here is on some of those distinctions between multi-generational housing, multifamily housing, additional residential units, granny flats, secondary suites. There's a lot of terminology that floats around, and just wanting to clarify when we're speaking to all of those different things that some of them are interrelated and some of them are less interrelated. So appreciate your comments around multi-generational or multifamily housing. I think that I agree that that's really important. Just for clarification, just want to make sure that that we're considering when we're talking about a granny flat or a granny suite or an additional residential unit, it's typically considered as something that's a self-contained unit. So say in Baysville, for example, where you have a property that has full municipal water, full municipal wastewater services connected to a home that is, say for argument's sake, a single detached home on a lot within Baysville, you'd be allowed to have, under the Planning Act permissions, a unit, say within your basement, within the house, another unit stay within a structure that's detached from your house. So the different terminologies of whether that's a laneway home or detached additional residential unit or however you want to consider that. But that those are self-contained units. So they would have be able to function sort of as an apartment, so to speak. And then when we're talking about multi-generational housing or multifamily housing, where you note that concern about not being able to have a second kitchen or those other sort of requirements of the Ontario Building Code, it's something really important to consider, and I'm glad that you raised it. But just wanting to make that distinction between those different housing types.
Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. I'll go to Jacqueline next, and then I'll pass it over to April to make some concluding remarks.
Okay,
Jacqueline.
That was a great report today. I just wanted to talk about the protecting natural environment. And you've got recreational lakes, dense forest cover, rocky outcrop. That's why we're here. We love it here. It's just, we love the views. So I'm going to get to vistas. I haven't read all of the discussion papers yet, but I was just wondering, have you considered vistas in the revision? I know they're in the old official plan, but I'd really like to see more about the vistas, because our lakes are they're like bowls, they're surrounded by trees and then cottages. And then, as Fraser said, these huge cottages are going in and in some cases changing vistas. And so that's a big concern to me, and blasting, but I know that's a whole other story. But is there anything in there, or what can we do to really push for more, protection on our vistas?
Sure, and maybe I can take a crack at responding first, and then pass it over to Dave or to April to add in. But just before I do respond, I'm curious to hear a bit more about what's important to you in protecting vistas. What I'm hearing is that that maybe large-scale development across from your property or other properties in the vicinity is something that you don't want to see, but just want to make sure that I'm clear on your comment.
Yeah, it's a general, I hear it a lot from people, that how vistas are being altered because of these larger developments. So it is a concern of mine, and as well. And I really like to see some more protection with that. And because it's really important. That's why we love it here so much. But then when you see this happening, it's very disturbing. So I just want to share that with you.
No, and thank you for clarifying that. It's certainly something that, as we're looking to develop a new official plan for the township, we're certainly not starting from scratch. So as we're going through to look at the township's current in effect official plan, look at changes that have happened, have conversations like this around the table, to hear from folks that are residents, business owners, other stakeholders about what you want to see. It certainly doesn't mean that we're throwing out old policy. Part of our technical review of the current official plan is looking to see what we want to carry forward, what aligns still with the community's vision for the next 20 to 30 years, what might have changed or evolved since when that document was initially prepared in 1999 and when it was last comprehensively reviewed in 2016, and finding that balance between taking what's useful for us into the future, updating things where things need updating, and where there are gaps, adding those policies in. Maybe I'll pass it to you, Dave, to add some more specific comments about protecting vistas.
I don't have too much else to add other than, I mean, even the provincial planning statement has policies on conserving what they call cultural heritage landscapes, and recognizing those as including areas with scenic views. So we definitely want to make sure that the current policies on vistas and there's other policies, as Rebecca mentioned, that we'd like to carry forward into the new OP where they're successful. So I'm definitely taking some notes to make sure that we address that and other things we've discussed today that have come up in the discussion, including the protection of viewscapes and vistas.
Thank you, Dave. And can I also ask about dark skies?
Mhm.
This is all part of it, right?
Mhm.
So I would really like to see that even address more teeth, because it's not working what we have right now.
Okay.
Gotcha.
Appreciate that comment.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. So I'm not seeing any hands up, and I really appreciate everyone staying on the line to 3:15. It's been a really great and productive discussion, and I'm really grateful to those of you who have raised your hand, asked a question, or offered a comment that will help us to, as we're moving forward with this project and putting our heads together to craft policy that will have an impact in shaping growth and development over the next 20 to 30 years in Lake of Bays. But just before we wrap up today's session, I'll pass it over to April to make some concluding remarks, and then we'll say goodbye.
Yes, thanks again, everyone, for attending today. Again, feel free to reach out to myself or the project team if you have any additional comments or questions, and make sure to join us in our future public engagement sessions as we move forward with the project. With that, if there's nothing further to add, I guess I hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.